Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm your co-host, Jodie.
And I'm your other co-host, Matthew. What have you been up to lately, Jody? How are you doing?
Just wrapping up this year and getting ready for the new one. What about you?
Yep, same here. It's nice. The week in between Christmas and New Year's always is so wild and fun, but I'm excited for 2025. It'll be a good time, or at least it'll be a time.
It's a
But yeah,
weird kind of limbo, isn't it? Where you're like, I should be getting stuff done, but I don't want to get stuff done.
yeah, and it's like, the holidays and stuff are over. You've got like New Year's left, and then you have to then it's just cold. It's just cold, and it's not fun. You have to deal with cold, but like none of the joy of
Mm.
December, of entering into the cold. It's always so fun when it's like finally it's cold. But after a few weeks, it gets old real fast.
It's almost like you're laying down on a ship that's being tossed back and forth in rocky waters. And you're
Sure.
just kind of like, what do I do next? As you wait for whatever is next to come. Kind of reminds me of this guy, Jonah.
What a segue. Yeah, today we're talking about Jonah. Good old Jonah. What a guy. Often you hear it as Jonah and the fish, but as we've learned through reading this, the fish takes up barely any of the book. But I'm excited. I'm excited for this conversation. Before we dive into it and talk about some of the more scholarly, nerdy type stuff, do you want to give us one of your fun summaries?
Of course I do. Okay, guys. So this dude, Jonah, is a prophet. And God tells him, hey, I want you to go to Nineveh and give them a little message. And Jonah's like, no, bro, I'm not going to Nineveh. That's like someone telling me that I need to go to Mobile, Alabama. It's perfectly nice. I'm not going. I've been once. I'm not going to go again. And so he decides, I'm going to get on a ship to somewhere else. And he gets on the ship. And while he's on the ship, a storm starts. And all of the sailors are like, oh my gosh, what is happening? Who have we made upset? And Jonah's just like underneath, down below. And he's just like, do, 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 kind of being like, I'm not going to do this for God. And the sailors are like, hey, can you come help? And they eventually figure out it's because of Jonah. So they toss him overboard, and he is swallowed by a large fish, not a whale, a fish. This is not Pinocchio, a fish. And then he's in the fish and he's like praying for giving a prayer of thanksgiving is what it was called. I'm a little confused on that. And then the fish spits him out. Did you know fish vomit? I double checked this
Do
because
they? Do fish
fish
vomit?
fish vomit.
Okay, yeah.
Fish actually vomit. So the fish spits him out, and he goes to Nineveh, and he tells them, "You must repent for your ways," kind of. And the people of Nineveh hear, and they change themselves, and the king hears, and everyone fasts and puts on. I want to say potato sacks. I could be wrong. Probably am. And Jonah's like, well, God, what are you going to do to them? And God's like, they're repenting. I shall show mercy. I shall show compassion. And Jonah's like, I didn't want that. You made I got swallowed by a fish. You made me come all the way here. You made me schlep all the way to Nineveh. And so then he goes and sits on a hill and he's like, no, God's going to do something about them. And so he sits on a hill and it's sunny and God gives him a bush. And Jonah takes the bush for granted until a worm comes along and eats the bush. And then Jonah's like, you took away my bush. And God's like, okay, so you care more about this bush than you do the people of Nineveh? And that is Jonah.
That is Jonah. So exciting. No, yeah, I'm excited to get into this in the weeds of the verses. But what a fun overview. Um, yeah, I mean, before we get started, do we want to kind of talk about some generic overview stuff?
Yeah, first things first, was Jonah an established prophet?
So Jonah is mentioned one other time in the Hebrew Bible. We get that in 2 Kings 14, um, where he prophesied for King Jeroboam II. And as we all know about King Jeroboam II, he was named after King Jeroboam I. King Jeroboam I was one of the worst kings of all of Israel, so we could expect King Jeroboam II to be even worse, just as bad. King Jeroboam II, a very, very bad king, two thumbs down by most people. But so Jonah prophesies for him, and Jonah notably prophesies positively for um, this king. And we get this in 2 Kings 14, like 23 through 25. So that's the only time we get Jonah throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And then if you read the story, you'll be like, okay, bad king, does bad things, tries to get land. Oh, Jonah, that's a name I recognize. Okay, and continue. So it's not like a big story that a lot of people pay attention to. But so Jonah is a name that people recognize because of that verse. So I'm guessing that whoever wrote this story uh, kind of picked up on that name and said, oh, we'll make a story about this character, or the tradition passed down from then.
Okay, because it kind of like, to get a message from God, you have to assume there's some kind of established relationship. And
Yeah.
and what was like the temperament at this time? Because we start off and he's like, I'm not going to Nineveh. Is there any specific reason why Nineveh was chosen, maybe in this scripture?
Yeah. So, it starts off with the author expecting the reader to know a whole lot of background information already right off the go. So Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire is the empire that really kind of destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. So the Assyrian Empire is the big bad oppressors. They're the biggest, baddest oppressors of the area. And Nineveh is the capital city. It's the centralized spot where like these are the embodiment of the oppressor. But notably, Jonah, the dating for Jonah, ranges a lot from anywhere between, I think I've seen 8th to the 2nd century BCE. A lot of those are fringe cases of theories. Most scholars would assume it's the 5th or 6th century BCE or the Persian period. And that's what I think would be most likely, so during the Persian period. And if we remember from Esther, also written during the Persian period, Jonah is a bit older than Esther. But Persians were generally a little nicer to the Jewish communities, the Judean communities. So it's interesting. Like the authorship and who it was written for and all that is not like a lot of these books and stuff I can say with some degree of certainty was probably written around this time for this person. Jonah, I'm not so sure. If I had to make a claim, I would say Jonah was written by um, uh, upper class Judeans in the Persian Empire, and it kind of seems to be either a way for the authors to be like, hey, be nice to our Persian overlords. Like they're chill, like we should be nice to foreigners and stuff like that. Like it seems fairly evident that one of the themes, one of the main points that Jonah is trying to get across is to, embrace foreigners. And the other way you could look at it is kind of the authors of this putting themselves in the shoes of Jonah. Of they're the ones that live under this Persian Empire, and they still have to go and like prophesy and like do their things under this Persian rule. And so they put themselves in the feet of Jonah because they have to go begrudgingly and whatnot. But I'm not sold on either of those completely. Those are just some of the theories I've heard. Did that answer your question?
It did, because I just really wanted to understand the context of like when this was written, because this is obviously a product of its time,
Mm.
and whatever message may be conveyed through this is going to be affected by what the temperament was towards Jews and how people were just feeling within maybe like their different classes or religions. So I just thank you for answering.
Yeah. No, and I think, with some stories, it's much more important, that background. I think with Jonah, given its genre, it's can still be interpreted and understood. I obviously when it was written, who wrote it, all that is very important. But I think it doesn't play as big of a role as conversations regarding other books, other stories. But it's definitely worth noting.
Yeah, because I really just couldn't understand why doesn't he want to go to Nineveh? Because I didn't know like about the
Mhm.
kingdoms, and I maybe that's something I would know if I was reading the Bible chronologically, but I've never done that, so I wasn't
Yeah,
sure if that would be conveyed.
yeah. Well, and then also in chapter one, Jonah never gives an explanation for why um, he's he doesn't go to Nineveh. It's not until chapter four where we get his big speech about how he knew God would forgive them and all that stuff. So I think they're kind of intentionally hiding that in the back. Like, why won't Jonah go here if God's calling him to go?
A little mystery,
A little mystery.
a little intrigue.
Um, but yeah, a note on the genre. I think most scholars would agree that this is close to what we would commonly call a satire. Um, like it's very clearly exaggerating. The city is very, very big. The fish is very big. Um, the ship is very big. Like everything is very, very big. Tarshish, um, is like literally the furthest point away from uh, like the explored world. So Tarshish is like it's this exaggeration, huge story. So I think satire is going to be the closest to what we kind of understand it as. There's some pushback in that Jack Sasson is one of the biggest names in Jonah scholarship, and he pushes back against that a little bit, or at least emphasizes that it's more serious than we would call it in a satire. But most scholars would say it's satirical in some sense.
Well, I think I would agree with most scholars, because like
Yeah,
how is this man having a giant temper tantrum not satire?
yeah. No, there's definitely humor in this, but Sasson implies that that's a little more on the interpreter than the author. But I think satire and humor is definitely a part of this book.
And there's nothing wrong. I think a lot of satire and humor can be used to convey serious messages, and some people receive
Mhm.
it better that way. So
Yeah,
maybe,
no, it's definitely a useful rhetorical device.
okay, so let's dive in.
Oh, so good.
Honey,
Um, yeah, let's start with the first couple verses. I'm sure that we'll get on a tangent on that before we get too far in. Or even the first verse. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, "Go at once to Nineveh." Um, First of all, some Hebrew puns going on here. Jonah is the word for dove, and Amittai is is faithfulness. So the word of the Lord came to dove, son of faithfulness, and right off the bat, like we're laughing uh, because if we know anything about Jonah, we know he's the furthest thing from faithful. Uh, so from verse one, we get that hint that something funny's going on here. The other thing we should note is this isn't like much prophecy. If flip to another prophetic book in your Bible, and you're going to see it's mainly the oracles from God to God, and it documents the conversation, the words of the prophet. Whereas here we have a narrative, which is very rare. It's the only time in the Hebrew Bible where we have the whole book just being a complete narrative. So there's weird things going on with Jonah. This isn't how we would expect a prophetic book to be written. It's Jonah is arguably a horrible prophet because he's running away from God. So like right off the bat, there's weird stuff going on.
So he says he's not going to Nineveh, and he decides he's going to go as far away as he possibly can from this calling from God. And he ends up on a ship.
Right. Okay. Let's back up a little bit. I told you we're gonna get stuck on these first few verses for a while. Because I don't think we've talked much about form yet. So for in this instance, I want to talk about the prophetic call narrative, the prophetic call form. Because again, I think something very special is happening here. Because a lot of times when prophets are called by God to do their prophesying and whatnot, it follows a very specific structure with some variance, intentional variance, and the variance is what gives it its extra meaning. And we usually see that in what is it, 5 or 6 steps? 6 steps. And this was introduced through Norman Habel, who's a scholar many years back, but for the most part, this scholarship still stands, still influential. And I like to use Exodus 3, the call of Moses, to kind of like do this example of like how the call narrative works. Step 1, we have divine confrontation with Moses. This is the burning bush, and God calls out to Moses and says, "Moses, Moses." We've all seen the 10 Commandments. After that's the introductory word, where, and in this case with Moses, God says, "Here I am," and tells him to remove his sandals from his feet and does all that stuff. Then the next is the commission. God says, "Go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh." And then notably, we get an objection. There's almost always an objection. Moses here says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" So with all these prophetic call narratives, there's this call and this rejection of the call. And that's going to be important when it comes to Jonah. We'll talk about that in a minute. But after that, we get reassurance. So God says that he'll be with Moses, and then ends with a sign of some sort. And that's, verse 12 of Exodus 3, saying, "This will be a sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." So a lot of prophecy or call narratives follow this structure, but we don't get that in Jonah, right?
No.
We get some of it. We get the divine confrontation, which is what we see in verse 1, and the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And we get the commission, or we get the introductory word, which is very literally one word here in English, arise, in my translation. And then we get the commission, which is to walk to Nineveh, call out against it because of their wickedness. But we don't really get the objection. The objection is usually in a verbal form. And I'm relying on the work of Brent Strawn here. He does a lot of work in Jonah. But instead of this objection, we get Jonah just fleeing. Instead of Jonah saying, "Hey, no, I can't do this," Jonah runs away. Which, is funny because like it starts with, "But Jonah arose." So we're thinking, in that instant there, like, oh, this is unlike any other prophet before. Jonah's getting up and going to do it. And then immediately after that, we see to flee to Tarshish, to Tarshish. So there's so much going on in these like short few verses where Jonah is ending this call narrative short. He's, usually the usually the prophet puts God on hold, says, "Hold up, wait," but Jonah just hangs up the phone right there, and we don't get the reassurance, we don't get the sign.
I mean, it could be an extended hold. I I maybe am stretching the definitions of these things, but to kind of fast forward a little bit, and we can always come back to this, like him fleeing could be the rejection, and then the reassurance could him being swallowed by the fish, the storm. Because like God's basically like, if I have to track you down and reassure you that you're gonna do this, it's
Yeah,
just a thought.
no, the call narrative usually has the Hebrew word amer to say, and then the objection, and that's missing here. We see that completely different here. And no, like it definitely feels like there's a like Jonah clearly is objecting in his way of running away, just in a different way than the literary form would expect it to.
Yeah.
Because then it misses the reassurance. And what Strawn proposes in his article um, is that when Jonah gets eaten up by the fish and spat out or vomited up to prophesy at Nineveh, he still has to do the job. He still has to get the job done. He just doesn't get the prophetic bonus of being reassured and the signs. So Jonah still has to do the work, but because he cut it off before the objection, he doesn't get to like be okay about it. So he cancels it.
Well, couldn't the reassurance in the sign be the fish? And like, or maybe God was just like, you don't get reassurance because you got on a ship. So I'm just gonna make you do this anyways.
No, that's the point that Strawn is making, that Jonah doesn't get reassurance.
Okay, okay, then we're on the same page.
Yeah. God says, you got to deal with this the hard way.
But I would say a sign still happens. I mean, to be swallowed by a fish and then spit out, because you spit out near Nineveh.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's a I would take that as a sign. Kind of
sure,
like a
sure.
blaring neon, you're gonna do this.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe not a sign that follows the way that the form would expect it to, but for sure there is an idea that Jonah's going to get this done, whether he likes it or not.
Because if it's a satirical prophecy, that kind of makes sense to me. Like if this is a satirical retelling of a prophecy or a prophet giving a message, then that makes a lot of sense to me. And I really want to see a stage production of this, because I'm just imagining a grown man crying on this stage, being like, I don't want to go to Nineveh.
Yeah, no, definitely. That would be fun to say, fun to see.
Okay,
but yeah, that's all I have on the first three verses. Sorry for that, tangent.
No, it's interesting and it's important because, I obviously need it drilled in that there is a form, but it is important to note that there is a form that these things follow. There's a formula. And if it doesn't follow that formula, then I guess the discussion is on if it's going to be taken seriously as a text.
Well, if it doesn't follow the form, the question should be, why doesn't it follow the form? What is the author trying to get across where this doesn't meet the standard idea of what's supposed to happen? Mm-hmm. And when the author plays with the form and when the author does these small things that adjust what you might expect, it's often because the author is making a comment or trying to get the reader to think a specific way or to focus on something. And I think that's what's happening here.
So, have we gotten to the part yet where we can guess why? Like, I guess we can talk about it at the end. So he's on a ship.
Okay.
He's on a ship. The ship starts tossing, and the sailors are trying to figure out what is going on. They're praying to their gods for safety while Jonah lounges downstairs because obviously he's not going to Nineveh and he's not going to care about these lives. I
Mhm.
would you say he feels a little like I'd rather die yet? Because he reaches
Oh
that
yeah,
point.
yeah. When's the first time he says that? I think it's in chapter one. Um, um, because he's just like ready. Because maybe he doesn't say that. Um, it's more in chapter six, but he does like offer for himself to be thrown overboard. And I think that's him saying, "Just kill me. Like, what do we need this for? I don't have to prophesy to Nineveh. Ain't nothing gonna make me do it. And if I die, so be it."
And then they cast lots. What are casting
Right,
lots?
right. So lots are this. The technical term kleromancy. It's widely attested in the Hebrew Bible. We see it all over the place. We saw it when we talked about Esther with the Pur, because Purim, when Haman cast Pur to um, choose the day in which he was going to commit genocide. It's a different word here in Jonah that is used a lot more often in the Hebrew Bible. But this terminology seems to be almost explicitly used in Israelite areas. So by painting the picture of the crew casting lots, it kind of shows them as being skilled in Israelite practice. And we should kind of compare these sailors with the Ninevites that we see later. Like these sailors, like cast lots, they do their thing and they figure out like what's going on. And they figure out like, oh, this Israelite God is who we should be worshiping. And these foreigners are portrayed in this very, very positive light, which is very notable. So I think, and we see that later. Like we don't just see that in the casting lots. We see that later in them worshiping the Israelite God. But to answer your question, casting lots is essentially the same as like um, drawing a straw, but using just a old fashioned way of doing it.
So it's divination.
Of some form, yeah.
It's a type that usually involves a random process. So some roll dice, some pick cards, straw or stock, rustling tree leaves. Okay, so the chance.
Yeah. It's drawing straws. They drew straws to figure out who's to blame, and it fell on Jonah.
That is so funny
Mhm.
because was completely chance. And then Jonah draws the shortest straw and has to be like, so here's what happened. I kind of got a prophecy from God, and I have to go to Nineveh. I don't want to. So this storm is because I don't want to go to Nineveh. And
Yeah,
he's like, you can throw me overboard, but because these sailors are like, we don't want your blood on our hands, they're trying to figure out something else. They're trying to save this man who has turned away from his God. And they're showing such mercy and compassion, even though their lives are in danger.
yeah. No, it's this portrayal of these sailors who are not Israelites being extra pious and extra good towards Jonah, which is not a depiction that we would expect. Um, it's very common in these texts to be fairly xenophobic, but we see the opposite here in Jonah. Like this is arguably the least xenophobic text in the Hebrew Bible.
That's nice. I like when people help each other. So this story is starting to grow on me.
Yeah,
I'm pro sailors because they're like,
yeah,
how can we help this guy who's turning his back? So okay. And then they decide
but
that
yeah,
they have to throw him overboard.
yeah, like because they're rowing back, they're trying to get back to land, but the storm's too big. They say the only thing we can do is throw this guy overboard, and Jonah's like, "That's fine, I deserve it. Go for it, dude."
Yeah. And
Oh,
he in the water,
yeah.
splashing around.
Notably, before we move on,
Oh.
in verse 4. To kind of really add on to the idea. I mean, this is the great storm, a huge storm, doing all of those things.
Mhm.
But we get that the ship threatened to break up. So there's this the Hebrew there kind of like throws on this personification of the ship. Like it's not that the ship creaked. It's not that the ship like was doing poorly. It's that the ship was threatening to break up. So there's this humanification of the ship going on, and I think that adds to the kind of silly satireness of the story.
Definitely, but also keeping in mind that there is that history of like sailors and like their ships being like called like female names and like, they
Right.
give female names to like cars now too, boats. But I thinking about that, I'm just like thinking the groaning sound of the ship to sound like it's threatening to break up, like
Yeah.
really puts onto you like how imminent the danger felt.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And they were still taking this time to
Yeah.
be like, what should we do? The
Mhm.
answer is obvious. We should throw this guy overboard. But they're like, but we don't want to. We don't want to be mean.
Mhm.
But he ends up in the water anyways, swimming around, and he is swallowed up by a fish. Notably, I see a male fish.
Yeah, no, so this is fun. This is one of those fun Hebrew Bible facts that like you can't get in English. So we get the fish mentioned 4 times, I think. Twice in chapter 1, verse 17. I'm using English uh, versification. The Hebrew Bible is a little bit different, but using the NRSV, fish is mentioned twice in verse 17, once in chapter 2, verse 1, and once in chapter 2, verse 10. So we got 4 mentions of the fish. In chapter 1, verse 17, it's a male fish and a male fish. In chapter 2, verse 1, it's a female fish. There's a female suffix on the word. And then at the end, it's back to a male fish. The female suffix is no longer. And it's one of those fun things that, like, I don't know what to do with it. What do we do with this? The fish changes gender. Um, the only ideas I've come across that make sense is that, well, there's 3. I have 3 ideas that come across. One's just for funsies. They said, this is a crazy little book. What if we add fish that changes gender to it? The second I've heard in rabbinic literature, sometimes they say that a male fish swallowed Jonah, and then he spat Jonah into a female fish's mouth, and then that fish spat Jonah into another male fish's mouth. So that's how they get around it. And a third way I've heard people get around it is that we think that chapter 2 is likely a later addition. This psalm probably wasn't original to the text. I mean, it reads pretty well if we just kind of take out that introduction and the psalm. Um, so I would say I lean towards that chapter 2 being a later addition, but it's not for sure. It's not like this is definitely a different source. And perhaps that source used the female ending for the fish.
I
But I'm
yeah.
sure you have thoughts.
My thoughts are here are fish that change sexes. Number 1, a clownfish goes from male to female. If the dominant female dies, the largest male will change sex. It's the first one. The kobuday, I don't know if I said that correctly, is a sequential hermaphrodite who changes sex once they hit a certain point in their life. So once they get to a certain stage, that's when they change from female to male. And finally,
Yeah.
the goby fish can change back and forth depending on factors related to age, size, or social status in the fish world. Or perhaps the fish was a female when she was pregnant with Jonah inside of her.
Yeah, who knows? And that could be what it's also saying, that like when Jonah was in the belly, They saw that, oh, Jonah was in the womb. It must be a female fish then. But no, like fun fish facts. You never know what you're going to learn at the religious treehouse. We're going to learn about fishes doing their fish thing. Oh,
Fish
I
puke
don't
and
think
have
this
sex
is.
changes. So
Yeah. I don't know if the Jonah is trying to make a scientific claim about fishes, but you know, we learn these things anyways.
it's just kind of cool sometimes how this ancient text does eventually, like, you can find evidence that it does line up somewhere. That doesn't mean it was intentional. It's just like Pangea. Like the Genesis, like you can line up Pangea with Genesis. That doesn't make it true. That wasn't purposeful.
Oh my goodness, Jodie, you're doing this again. You're making more out of the text than what's there. Come on, come on.
I'm just saying, man, crazy coincidences. Put me in a tinfoil
Okay.
cap.
Okay, moving on from that, um, we have. Oh no, this is one of my favorite comments, though. I can't move on quite yet. I have to have the last word. Apparently, let me have this last word. Um, but I never seen this brought up in the transgender debate, and I, think it would be a fun thing to bring up when people talk about, transgender, because apparently it is in the Bible. And I think that's a fun thing to think about. I'm not going to comment on it, but people should know that the fish changes gender.
And I'll let Matthew have this last word because I agree with him.
Cool. So then we get to this psalm of thanksgiving. Do you have thoughts on that?
Why was it happening? Oh,
Yeah.
why was that there? Like, okay, part of me understands because obviously he's feeling regretful. Like he's like, I don't want to be in here. I'm scared. This is, and I think, yeah, Sheol is what he mentions in verse 1 of chapter 2.
Hmm.
And that was me kind of wondering if the fish had a name, but you have informed me that it is kind of like the idea of hell.
Yeah, so we have in the beginning of the poem we get, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. And this is just, prophetic, or not prophetic, poetic language here. Sheol, um, I think this might be the first time we've encountered it in this podcast, but it's this idea of like an afterlife, kind of like Hades, where that's just where everyone ends up. Like when you die, this is what happens. So there's like this notion that like there's some part of the person lives on that does something, but the theology isn't really fleshed out, and it's just this general idea of like a vague afterlife type thing.
Okay, but so Jonah basically thinks he died.
Well, I mean, it's poetic licensing here. It's Jonah being dramatic. Like I'm in the belly of a fish, I'm in hell, like that type of thing.
But so then why wouldn't he assume he's dead? Why wouldn't he assume like this is it? He's repenting.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. If I were in a fish, I would think I was dead.
Like he's thinking
But
this is
yeah,
the end. This is the end. I'm in a fish. I'm going to be digested and
you're right.
then end up on the ocean floor. Like, and then he gets to the end of this prayer and he is vomited onto dry land
Yeah.
near Nineveh. And could that be taken as the reassurance? I know, I understand this does not follow the formula, but I mean, to think you're going to die in the belly of this large transgender fish and to be spat out near where your path in life was supposed to take you,
Hmm.
I think it could be taken as a reassurance in a very stretched out
Sure.
way.
Yeah. I don't think I see where you're coming from. I don't think that's what the literary form and structure is implying. Um, I think we would have seen that much earlier, like within the call narrative, the call form. And we don't see that here per se. And especially when we get to the beginning of chapter 3, we see that this format restarts, and we'll talk about that when we get there.
Yeah.
But I think the prophetic call that we get in the beginning of chapter 1 kind of ends without Jonah's objection, and we get this as a result of it.
Okay. And then in 2:6, he's talking about being at the bottom of like a valley underneath bars. And I just wanted to say that that gave the same vibe as Kronos and the Titans being locked up in Tartarus and Hercules.
Yeah, no, we're in a bad place.
He's
Jonah's
definitely
wanting to make sure. Yeah.
like it really feels like chapter 2 is just like saying like, I know I did wrong and now I'm stuck here and I'm suffering. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's but it's weird. It's definitely a weird psalm to be stuck in here. 'Cause, it's often categorized as a psalm of thanksgiving. He says in verse 9, "But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you." And that's not what we would expect here. We would expect a psalm petitioning for help, like, "Hey, God, help me out." And whether this is just kind of inserted here willy nilly, or this is Jonah saying, "Hey, God, thank you for killing me." Like, maybe this is a continuation of chapter 1. I think it's a possibility. I think, or this is just adding to the weirdness of Jonah. Like, weird things happen in Jonah. That's part of the point of Jonah. Um, so I don't know. I don't have a good answer for why this Psalm of Thanksgiving is in here. It just kind of is, and we're dealing with it.
We're riding the wave, might you say.
Yeah.
The water puns
Yeah.
won't be stopping anytime soon, people. The man was swallowed by a fish. It's my duty.
No, it really is. But yeah, and then do we have anything else? Do you have anything else on chapter 2 before we move on?
No, I think I talked about it more than I expected to because really, when I read through it the first time, I was like, throw this one away. But then I
Hmm.
started to think about like the feelings of Jonah, and I started to have the feelings of Jonah, and I wanted to cry for him.
Yeah.
Because, yeah. But moving on to chapter 3, God tells Jonah again, go to Nineveh. So, like you said, we restart.
Hmm. Yeah,
We,
we get this reintroduction of the call narrative. The word of God came to Jonah a second time. That's the divine confrontation.
Mhm.
We have the introductory word, get up, same thing as last time. And then we have the commission. It says, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you. And then once again, we expect an objection, and we don't get it. Instead, we get Jonah set out and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. And again, we think, great, Jonah's doing good. We're so proud of Jonah. Until he gives his sermon, which is literally the shortest sermon in the entire Hebrew Bible, in the entire Bible. It's in Hebrew, it's 5 words, and like he says nothing. In the NRSV, it says 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. What does that mean? What does that tell anyone? It's not them saying what they did wrong. It's not telling them what God said in chapter 1. It's just Jonah going up there saying, you're going to be overthrown, and everyone freaks out. Everyone goes, oh my goodness, you're so right, Jonah. We got to repent. So, and Jonah's just there like giving, the worst sermon of all time, and it's simultaneously the most effective sermon in all of the Bible. Like, it's just so absurd. And that's the point, that Jonah, again, doesn't do the thing where he's supposed to object. And because we know what he wants. He doesn't want Nineveh to be over to he doesn't want Nineveh to repent. So again, by cutting out that objection, he doesn't get the reassurance, he doesn't get the sign, and then he gets his temper tantrum in the next chapter.
It's kind of like he was doing the least he could to like say
Yeah.
he did the assignment,
Mhm.
and if you think about this, like thinking about it from maybe the mind of a divine being, you're like, okay, dude, I want you to go here and what? No, don't get on that ship. Okay, I'm gonna have a fish eat you, and we're going to get a redo. We're going to restart. We're gonna start this over. And then he's like, oh, he's not even objecting. Like, okay, this smooth sailing. You guys need to change, otherwise you'll be overthrown in 40 days. Peace. What was
No,
that,
no,
Jonah?
it's not even you need to be changed. You need to change. It's just in 40 days you'll be overthrown.
Uh,
Like you gave him far more credit than he deserves.
I really did. I did. He did the least he could, and
Yeah.
then sat on a hill and was like, haha, burn them.
Yeah, yeah, and like even like remember, Nineveh's this great city. Anytime Nineveh's mentioned, it's Nineveh, the great city, the city that's a 3 days walk across, which is way bigger than Nineveh actually was. But it's this huge, huge city is what it's getting across. And we get in chapter 4, Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's walk. He's not even in the middle of the city. He just began going into the city. He like the point of this isn't that Jonah got up to do what God did. The point is Jonah got up to do the least required of him. Like Jonah's still not a good prophet.
Jonah, man, I'm really trying to pull for you here, but gotta throw me a bone.
Mm.
Because
And
he's
then despite that, despite Jonah telling them nothing and giving any reason for it, everyone, the king, the people, everyone, the animals repent and they like make everything better. And Jonah's just standing. You have to imagine Jonah just standing there, like, why are they doing this? Why are they repenting? Why are they fixing this up? And it's just this crazy, absurd portrait of random stuff happening.
Oh, I'm trying to think because I'm sure there is a TV show or a movie this reminds me of where a character is doing something begrudgingly, and the people that they're like, oh, I hate them. All of these so-called like hateful, terrible people
Yeah,
are like, oh no, we see the error of our ways. Look,
yeah.
you're right. The absurdity, it's just absurd. It
And it's not even that they listened to Jonah and heard that, oh, if we do better, God will save us. Like they're doing this despite that. They're doing this just in case God changes God's mind. Like maybe God will still, destroy us and stuff. Oh well, we're gonna do this anyways, because the Ninevites, the people who are like the biggest oppressors of the Hebrew Bible, are just gonna like change their mind and like be cool and good, which is so funny.
and they're displaying more faith than Jonah, a prophet.
Yeah, yeah, just like the sailors.
Just like the sailors. That's crazy. Crazy,
Hmm.
dude.
And again, that's the point of this book, or I should say, that's a point of this book. That like, hey, even foreigners can be, good people, and like we should have mercy on them too, perhaps.
Perhaps we should all
We
just
get
get along.
perhaps.
Perhaps. Okay, so that's chapter 3. God decides not to destroy them. We get to chapter 4.
Mm,
Jonah hears this and throws the temper tantrum to end all temper tantrums. Because he's
yeah.
just like, what do you mean you're not smiting them? Where is the hellfire raining from the skies? And so he
Yeah.
sits on a hill.
No, we get the answer to why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh, because he's very well versed in the Bible. He says, "I know you, God. I know exactly who you are. I've got you pegged. I've got you figured out. You're gonna forgive them, and I don't want that." So we learned that's why Jonah doesn't do this, and we see throughout this text that Jonah knows his stuff. Jonah knows his Bible. Jonah knows God. He knows his theology and stuff. The the poem, which I didn't mention, is comprised of verses from various psalms. So it's comprised of a bunch of different little lines from a bunch of different psalms, all put together into this poem that we have here. So Jonah knows his stuff. Jonah is very knowledgeable. He's got his stuff down, and he knows that God is going to forgive them, which is why he doesn't want to go to Nineveh.
So, I mean, I guess what's going through my mind right now is that is part of the purpose of this story to show that even if you're one of God's faithful followers, like you too can succumb to doubting or wanting to reject that divine calling and, kind of showing that maybe people who don't necessarily follow that faith aren't always the ones in the wrong. I guess I'm just thinking about the
I think
way Jonah is presented, like in this fourth chapter where he knows so much. He's so
right.
knowledgeable. And yet still he doubts, he rejects. And all of these foreigners who have in other Bible stories been told to be harmful or just kind of not moral followers,
Mhm.
they're displaying more faith, more trust, more kindness even.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that would be a claim made in a lot of sermons today. I don't know if that exact idea would be what the author is intending.
Mm.
Um, I think what I think I heard from you was much more personalization that like this story of Jonah applies to the everyman. Um, like, and I think maybe that's what the author was getting across. But I think that is adding a lot of moralizing, a lot of modern concepts onto it. But it's very easy to jump to get there, and I don't think you're necessarily wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still trying to break out of turning every Bible story into a sermon, but also just I do believe stories are written to get a message across. And
Right.
if like, and I'm totally fine being wrong, but
Mm,
what I'm getting is to show that maybe just being a follower of a religion and knowing things and doing things the correct way doesn't give you the right to pass judgment and not show compassion and mercy to other people.
right. No, no, that would be a very modern retelling of this. I think. I think if I were to pick at your statement a little bit. I don't think that their concept of religion, I don't think there necessarily was a concept of religion back then. So to I think this category that we have of religion
Mm.
can't really be imposed onto the text the way that we would want it to. And I think this is much more to do with national differences, um, power struggles, um, nationally speaking, much more so at least.
No, definitely. And I can be honest about it. I have a personal thing with this because, you see a lot of people who um claim to be very much like Jonah, very good followers. They know exactly what's going to happen and then they don't follow through with the teachings. So,
Sure.
that's where I'm coming from. I'm feeling very holier than thou art today. So, okay, so God retorts back asking if Jonah is right to be angry, that he
Mm,
what right do you have to be upset that I showed them mercy? Jonah leaves
yeah.
the city and makes a shady booth and sits.
Mm,
Obviously not shady enough though because God provides a bush.
yeah. No. Oh, good eye there. It's funny because he gets a booth for shade, a sukkot, and then also a bush. You're like, okay, cool. Extra shade. Jonah is nice and shady
So, and Jonah was
until
pretty happy with that.
Yeah, Jonah's like, fine. If we're gonna forgive these people, then at least I have shade.
Yeah. So, and then God sends a worm to attack the bush,
Uh-huh.
and then a hot wind, and then Jonah gets
Yeah.
upset and is ready
Uh-huh.
to die again. So dramatic.
Yeah. Hmm. Dramatic Jonah. What else can we say?
God again asks if his anger is justified.
Yeah, and Jonah's like, yes, it certainly is. My anger is justified. So justified that I could die.
No. And then God smacks some sense into Jonah and asks rhetorically if God also. Sorry.
Hmm.
I think I just became dyslexic for a hot second.
Oh no, you're good. But no, no. God says, um, to quote the final verse, and should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals, which I think is a great way to end this book, because on the one hand getting the message across that I think the author is trying to get the reader to wrestle with, because Jonah doesn't answer. We're left wondering what Jonah says. Does Jonah agree that that God should also be concerned about Nineveh, or does Jonah also disagree with God again and say no? And that's the thing that I think this text wants the reader to wrestle with. How can I come to terms with God forgiving my enemy? I think that if we want to put a
Okay.
moralizing message on this, if we want to make an overall say, this is the moral story that's happening here, my gut says that's what the author was trying to get across. But in such a funny way, because we don't end it with this serious notion. We end it with, and also many animals. Like, like there's so many people there that we should care about, and even the animals. And I think there's some seriousness to that. There's all these people and the animals, but when we think about this, animals isn't usually what comes to mind. And I think that's just a little poke at the end of the book to be like, isn't this funny?
Is this an animal rights story? We have a transgender fish and the mention of animals at the end because the
So
animals even fasted.
yeah, no, sure, we can make this an animal rights story if you want.
I don't know. But that's just the cool thing about like these texts and then people reading them and interpreting them. And obviously mine was more Sunday church sermony, but that's because that's what I grew up with. I would love to
Right.
know how someone who is just reading this for the first time, like what their thoughts are. I
Yeah,
am honestly kind of jealous of people who get to read biblical texts without all of the background
yeah.
and upbringing that we have.
Yeah, because especially with Jonah, there's the VeggieTales factor. This story has been told to us again and again, in Sunday school, growing up in church. Like so many Christian youths are told, the basic story: the Adam and Eve, the Noah's Ark, Jonah and the whale. That like it's lost its meaning, it's lost its purpose. It's seen as a children's tale, and I think these stories are so much more interesting than just saying it's a children's narrative that we don't have to pay attention to.
Yeah. And I will admit I did watch the VeggieTales version last night, guys, as I
Of course.
do when there is a VeggieTales version. Um and it was very much I was like because after we read it the first time, I was like, how are they going to turn this into a story? Because I was just reading it and laughing because I'm like, this dude Jonah, he is just insane. He's throwing temper
Mm,
tantrums everywhere. But in the VeggieTales story, one of the girls wins a sweepstakes and kind of does to Junior the broccoli what I did to you last week with the hot chocolate ice cream at Orange Works, the Neener Neener. Oh, look at what I got.
sure.
She does that with her sweepstakes ticket and then she loses it. And then Junior's mean to her, and the pirates who don't do anything overhear this and are like, you should learn compassion. And then it shows you a menu because they're at a seafood restaurant and it says compassion for market price. And then they just go on this wild retelling of Jonah. And
Yeah.
it makes me wonder, like, how far can artistic license go before you're retelling a story out of order and with,
Mm.
I don't know, too much. Like there was, I felt like context was added in, but I'm getting critical over a children's Bible story, but maybe that's because
Yeah.
it's what we grew up on and now I feel like I don't understand or really learn the text.
Yeah. No, it's so common for children's, especially Christian media, children's Christian media, to reduce these messages to a single, you know, moral idea. Like we should just be nice to each other. Right? This one, we should have compassion. And sure, like we could get that out of Jonah, but I think, and we only hit the surface of this. Like we could talk about some of the other themes and stuff going on. Um, but it's so easy to reduce these stories to a single word, a single idea that just like, okay, we should be better, we should be kind, and then we leave it at that. As from 7 years old to however old anyone in church is, they say that's the message of Jonah. No need to go back there because I've got it down. And I think these texts are so much intricate, so much more, you know, uh, purposeful, and have so much more detailed things to say that you don't get from be compassionate.
Yeah. So I am so excited to maybe delve into Jonah another time because after these first few rereadings, I definitely think I could read this again and again and look at things from a different way.
Yeah, no, it's a fun one and a short one.
And we definitely did not make this episode short, guys. I think we said originally our plan was to go like 30 minutes. And we have
And
gone, yeah.
again, we go way over expected. But here we are. Whatever. Thanks for listening, everyone. Follow us on, all the social medias and whatnot. Like and subscribe. Do all that fun stuff that I don't understand. And yeah, have a good one.
Yep, like and again, definitely like and subscribe. Actually, really, I'm going to list out all the social medias: TikTok, Twitter, call it X if you want, Bluesky, Instagram. Um, really anywhere, comment. We want to converse. So if you have any questions about this episode, please feel free to go to Instagram or TikTok and ask them. I'll make Matthew answer. If you have a question specifically for me, let me know. This is a Try Guys hoodie if you're watching the YouTube video. So it's been a great time.
Sweet. All
Bye,
right.
guys.
Bye, y'all.
I'm swimming with fishes here in the belly of the whale. I'm highly nutritious here in the belly of the whale.
Oh,
They said
okay,
whale so
get
many
a thing
times.
on Spotify.
Yeah. Honestly, it was all whale.